So it was a sort of an odd week in a way, wasn't it? It started off so slowly. President Trump going, what was it, more than 24 hours, I think, without speaking to the media, to the White House reporters. And then suddenly the middle of the week just exploded with news, giving further credence, I think, to that notion that not a week, not a day, but an hour is a very long time in the Trump White House.
I kind of think I jinxed it because at the beginning of the week, when he hadn't kind of made any public appearances on Tuesday, I loudly and repeatedly said that I was having a quiet, chill week.
Oh,
Oh, Bernie, you never
Um,
Bernie!
do that.
I
Never
No,
do
know,
that.
I
Not
know,
in the newsroom.
rookie
It's your
move, rookie
fault.
move.
never
But
say that.
That word is banned in the newsroom. Quiet. You don't say
Yeah, only in
yeah,
the
well,
privacy of your own home with no microphones nearby are you allowed to say that it's
I, I
quiet.
got a little too confident for a second, and
it. Well, I came in on Monday, which was Memorial Day, and obviously there were plenty of Memorial Day commemorations, excuse me, but it was obviously light staff on a holiday, and I thought, okay, I really wonder how this week will shake out because, as you said, Katrina, we hadn't heard much from President Trump. But here we are again with plenty to talk about and plenty of the news and issues that we've been discussing in the past weeks escalating really once again.
Mm. I wonder if it's kind of useful at this point, because there has been so much news, if we kind of take a step back and look at, some of those people who are in the president's favor and what that means for them and how beneficial it can be. And for those who fall out of his favor, just how difficult that can be and how you can find yourself really targeted by the administration and their measures. I mean, what comes front to my mind is Harvard University this week, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I know all of us have been speaking to students and following the reaction from the university, but I think what is really interesting is just see this larger battle here, as you said, Katrina, between President Trump and the US's oldest and perhaps most famous university. And this is, not necessarily about the intricacies of the legal battle between these two sides, but rather about the ideological battle between the two. And that's been really fascinating to follow. And if you talk to students, as we have, especially foreign students, there was this flurry of activity where they weren't sure whether they would be able to stay on campus or whether they'd have to leave. I mean, this is also very much about how the U.S. is being seen abroad. And just to recap, obviously, for our listeners who have been following this and viewers, the Trump administration has put a lot of pressure on Harvard and threatened to cut all of its federal funds, accusing it of allowing anti-Semitism to flourish on campus and also left-wing radical thought, and not allowing space for a diversity of viewpoints and allowing for DEI classes and programs and so on and so forth. Harvard has pushed back against that, but it really stands out, as you said, Katrina, for being a battle that tells us a lot about where the Trump administration sees its priorities right now in the ideological and cultural sphere.
and I think it's almost kind of a symbolic move that's not necessarily well, it's at least only partly about Harvard as an institution in of itself, but its kind of place in America and kind of around the world. I mean, I think it's fair to say it's probably the, if not one of the, or one of, if not the, most famous institution in America. It kind of made it such a good one for the Trump administration to make an example out of, whether it's, reviewing the 100 million in federal contracts that the government has with Harvard, or the issue with the international students. Every other university that's had an issue with the administration, and there are many, dozens at this point, they'll all be watching to see what happens here. And I think that's kind of going to be kind of one of the storylines of the next few months is, depending on what happens with Harvard, institutions will look at that and see whether they want to kind of give in to the demands of the administration or push back as Harvard has.
Because the president and the administration, they're kind of hitting Harvard twice, aren't they? I mean, withdrawing the funding, as you mentioned, Sumi, but also these extra measures that we've seen about revoking visas for Chinese students, pausing temporarily the processing or at least the scheduling of interviews for foreign students traveling on J visas and F visas, student visas and exchange visas, all of which contribute masses amount of cash, not just to Harvard, but to most of the American universities. I mean, in some campuses, including Harvard, you can have a quarter of a third, maybe even more than that, who are international students paying masses of money to these universities that then enable them to provide more places and essentially kind of subsidize in a way the research that some of these universities are doing, or the places that they can provide for American students as well. So there's kind of like a dual attack on them. And I can say, as someone who isn't American and, you know, who grew up visiting America and as a student in Ireland, like it was great swag to come on your, you know, J1 working holiday visa to the US, or even just a holiday, and come back with a sweatshirt or a t-shirt that said Harvard or Yale or Princeton or, you know, UCLA or whatever it was. Like the brand power, the soft power for America of these major universities around the world can't be underestimated.
But you know, I think there's such an interesting point to this to be made about the Trump administration understanding very well the battle that they're going into. And I think they have anticipated, and perhaps rightly so, that this is a battle they'll win in the court of public opinion. You know, I saw this outrage on Twitter over something that the Education Secretary, Linda McMahon, had said in an interview on CNBC. And I wrote it down because she said, universities should continue to be able to do research as long as they're abiding by the laws and in sync, I think, with the administration. And there was this outcry over what was perceived as the administration saying that private independent universities should follow their rules or follow their policies. But she was specifically talking about federal funding. And there is a sense with a university like Harvard that has an endowment of more than $50 billion that, you know, they don't necessarily need the taxpayer dollars that they've gotten for this research. And I found it interesting to see there was this Gallup poll that was conducted in June of last year, so before President Trump came back into office, showing that a growing number of Americans have lost trust and confidence in higher education, so in universities. And obviously Harvard being the most elite of them all, but it was remarkable. I think it was in 2015, 57% said that they had a great deal or a lot of confidence in higher education in the US. And by last year, when this was conducted, that had slipped to around 32% or 35, between 32 and 35%. And I think that's what the Trump administration is banking on here, understanding that people don't identify with this iconic yet very elitist in many people's eyes institution.
And I think it's also kind of a campaign promise as well. I mean, the issue of trade schools and getting more people into trade schools was something that came up on the campaign trail. So now with this issue at Harvard, I mean, not only is he hitting Harvard in its pocketbooks with the federal contracts and the international students who are more likely to pay full rate for their time at Harvard than many American students, but also he can frame it as kind of a domestic win as well in terms of, you know, encouraging people to go to trade schools, you know, opening up slots at Harvard for U.S. nationals. And that's something that he mentioned as well. So I think from the perspective of the White House, they're seeing this as like a very politically astute move, and this is a fight they're very ready and kind of almost happy to have in court in front of, you know, all the world's cameras to see.
The interesting thing as well, though, is not all American universities are, you know, the president would call Harvard liberal, left-leaning, you know, hotbed of liberalism, all of this. I mean, they're not all like that. I'm thinking of Liberty University, for example, which is a very conservative university, which will have very different kind of ideologies than Harvard would have, and the students who go there accordingly. But I mean, they'll also be impacted about the restriction of visas on foreign students as well, and potentially the cash that will be reduced from there. And it just opens up that gamut for if there is at a time in the future a Democratic president who also wants to withhold funding because they don't like what's being studied at a particular university or you know, principles that aren't being followed, that could also be withheld. So there's two sides of the coin there. And I mean, I've been speaking to some people on our shows and privately as well who are just very concerned about the kind of concept of thought control here.
Yeah.
That if everyone is just studying and learning and researching topics that align with certain principles, whichever principles they may be, that you just remove what universities are supposed to be about, which is broadening your mind, hearing different viewpoints, protesting if needs be to bring about change, as we know, great history of that in this country as well.
And I think the part that the administration hasn't really answered to is, if international students come to that conclusion that you just mentioned, that they're not free to think in the United States, that they might wind up in trouble, that they might have their social media kind of trawled through before getting here. If they don't come to the United States, they're going to go somewhere else. So I think, what the US loses here inevitably is someone else's gain, whether that's the UK or places in Europe or China or Asia in general. That's the part that I think the administration hasn't publicly addressed, is what this means for America's standing in the world if it's no longer this hub of very bright young people.
And that's precisely the point I've been hearing, not only from Democrat voices, but as you said, Katrina, from also other voices, some conservative voices who are concerned about what this might mean if there is another Democrat in office. But also, you have these big research institutions, big state universities in Republican states as well that do get a lot of federal dollars and benefit from that. And you can't forget that, there are many economists like Mariana Mazzucato who have written about the fact that federal dollars can be a great innovation driver. It's that public-private partnership that's been very effective. Of course, think about the internet and Google, all of these things that have been invented with the help of government taxpayer dollars. And cutting that off, or perhaps putting that at risk, could really have a long-term impact on the US's standing in research and excellence and exceptionalism, if you will, in some of these science and research fields. And to your point, Bernie, especially so if students no longer feel like they can or want to come to the US.
I mean, it would have to be going through your mind if you're a student now. And again, we have spoken to many of them on our programming this week. You jump through all the hoops you have to jump through to get acceptance at an American university. Really excited about it. It's going to cost you a lot of money, not just the fees, but, the accommodation, living in the US for 4 years, 6 years, whatever it may be. And potentially you're not going to get the visa because your social media will be gone through at an embassy, and who knows what. I mean, we were waiting those guidelines. We don't know what they are yet. Would be a trigger to you being refused your visa. If that's a risk, are you even going to apply to come to an American university in the first place? Particularly postgraduate students, who maybe, as you're saying, Sumi, are going to research labs or hoping to make great discoveries in the US, be it in healthcare or tech or whatever realm. You're just going to not even bother.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the students that we've been speaking to, I was speaking to on air on one of our programs, a student who was born in China but raised in New Zealand and had come to the US. And you can hear the real sense of disappointment in their voices, because this is seen not only as a country where there is plenty of opportunity, but as institutions that really can be a jumping off point for careers in the US as well. And as that path is narrowing, you really wonder what impact that's going to have on the decision people make to come here to study, but then to work, to stay, to contribute perhaps to that body of science and research in the US. And if there are countries that benefit, we've talked before about the fact that, for example, France's president Emmanuel Macron has said, he welcomes scientists and researchers to France, those who perhaps cannot come to the US. This could be a lost opportunity for many universities in the US. But the Trump administration has been very clear that, first of all, they see universities as being these breeding grounds for radical left-wing thought, A, and B, that they think that, universities like Harvard did not do enough to combat anti-Semitism. And I was speaking with the protests over the war in Gaza after October 7th, and I was speaking to somebody from the Crimson newspaper on air, Harvard's Crimson newspaper on air, and asked him specifically about how Jewish students see this battle between the Trump administration and their university. And he said, look, there are both. There are some Jewish students who say they don't like this battle being carried out in their name by the Trump administration, but there are others who did not feel safe and do not feel safe on campus in a learning environment where they feel like they are targets of protesters or advocacy groups. And so I guess it's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic in particular develops.
I think in Harvard's case, it's interesting because, I mean, we've heard from Israeli students who could, in theory, be, their time at Harvard could come to an end, or their admissions to Harvard might grind to a halt, over this issue in which they're supposedly the ones being protected here. So it's really complicated, but I think that kind of division, we saw that last year with the protests on college campuses as well, in which we saw kind of Jewish communities at a lot of these universities, Columbia, for example, split between those who didn't feel safe and those who were kind of active participants in the protest. So I think that's kind of highlighted that fissure again, that it's not some sort of monolithic block of left and right students, or students on one side of the argument versus the other. It's complicated.
It is. And I mean, that's highlighted by the singling out of Chinese students to have their visas actually revoked. So that's people who are here in the US, potentially about to graduate or halfway through their course of study, and their visas are going to be just, torn up. They don't know what their situation is now either. And the administration is saying the singling out of China in particular is about a national security concern and about connections to the Chinese Communist Party. But it hasn't said what defines a connection. I mean, something like 1 million people are members of the Chinese Communist Party. So is it if your immediate family, your aunt, your uncle, your second cousin twice removed, what is going to cause you to be able to come or not come to the US? And, what are these national security concerns that they have as well?
Yeah, and I also wonder how all of this will shift in public perception. I mean, I mentioned the fact that I think, the Trump administration believes it has a good leg to stand on in its battle against Harvard, well, as other universities and perhaps big state universities are also perhaps caught in a battle with the Trump administration. That perception could change. And if you have, an order that would involve all foreign students, those who have nothing to do with protests, perhaps, um, uh, who are caught up in such an order, that could also become more difficult for the administration. But I mean, speaking of perception, I'm really, really interested to see kind of all of the coverage and interest over this multi-million dollar dinner that Donald Trump
Yeah.
had with crypto investors. The White House said this was a private event, not an official event. But of course, the presidential seal was at this dinner. He was invited as the president of the US. And it's just opened up this massive discussion, hasn't it, about profiting from the presidency and what is acceptable and what isn't. I mean, what do you guys make of this?
I think it's almost shown how much the goalposts have moved from previous administrations. I think if this had happened in a different White House, this would have been a much bigger deal. And now, because of the way things are here in Washington, it was, I felt as it was swept aside quite quickly. It's not something that I really heard come up at the White House much this week. It just shows, for this kind of a pattern, having Teslas on the White House lawn, that sort of thing, that all these things are now slightly more normal than they ever were in the past, which shows, how what a different administration this is.
I think as well, using Steve Bannon's expression, flood the zone,
Hmm.
that there's just so much happening. And that's kind of one of the MOs of this administration as well, isn't it? Like just keep the news coming that us and all of our colleagues in the other media organizations are just scrambling to cover all of the angles. And I think with that dinner specifically, I mean, we should say there's nothing unusual in a way about sitting presidents having fundraising dinners. I mean, they all do it. They go
Yeah.
to wealthy donors' homes in New York, in LA, whatever. People pay crazy amounts of money for a seat at a table. I mean, the reports, of the Donald Trump dinner is potentially about $1 million a head. Some reports saying even more than that. JD Vance seemingly did a fundraiser in Las Vegas this week ahead of speaking at the Bitcoin conference also, where the kind of price of admission was about $1 million. But, Democratic presidents have done that. Democratic and Republican lawmakers do that. It's one of those things that for us who aren't American just find incredible about US politics, how much money is involved and how much money people have to raise. But I guess the difference here seems to be with the Trump coin dinner in particular, is that it wasn't going to a fundraising pack. It was people who had bought his coin. I mean, it's $TRUMP. I'm not sure how we pronounce that. Do we call it dollar
Trump
Trump? Do we
coin,
call it
Trump.
Trump coin? How do is there a cool way of saying that? But it was people who had bought that. So that, it seems to be, is going straight into the pockets of Donald Trump, or at least his business enterprise, rather than going into a political fund or to the Republican Party writ large.
And the fascinating part to me is how much that the cryptocurrency community now seems to be seen as kind of a vital part of Donald Trump's base and the Republican Party. I mean, they're very, very enthusiastic about him on the whole. And JD Vance said himself at the Bitcoin conference in Las Vegas that for the first time in the White House we have a pro crypto president sitting in the Oval Office, and I think that's it just shows kind of a changing pattern in America. I mean, this wasn't ever really the case
And in
before,
President
where
Trump as well.
and
Yeah.
President Trump, yeah.
I mean, what
So
did he say? The Bitcoin was a scam against the dollar just like
Yeah.
3 or 4 years ago?
yeah, it wasn't that long ago, and it just shows how opinions and the base has shifted a bit.
Yeah, and I think, if you also look at the fact Democrats are obviously raising the alarm over this and saying this is an example of the chaos and corruption of the Trump administration. And it's so interesting to see the response from members of the Trump administration who were asked specifically about the opportunity for corruption here. Obviously, the point that Democrats are making is if you buy Trump coin, if that's what we're calling it, this meme coin, I mean, you have the direct opportunity to influence the president. And we've seen Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, say, well, nobody's concerned because Americans know that Donald Trump has their best interest at heart, not his own. I found it also really interesting to see the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who was asked about this, and he said, people called the Bidens the Biden crime family because they were doing all this stuff behind closed doors. Donald Trump and his family are doing all of this out in the open. And I think the words he used was, whatever President Trump is doing, it's out in the open. They're not trying to conceal anything. That whatever felt like it was carrying a lot in that sentence. We've spoken to some Republicans also on our programs, you can tell are a bit reticent when it comes to what the possibilities for corruption are here in this entire industry and for the administration, for Donald Trump himself. But the fact that they believe that President Trump is doing this out in the open is a sign of transparency that Americans can get behind. I wonder if that's the case.
Yeah, it's kind of the blurring of the lines in a way, isn't it? Like, I mean, going back to what I was saying about donors at dinners, like you could argue that you have influence over the president if he's in your fancy house in LA in a mansion that you've paid whatever to get in there, and you have the chance to have a chat over a cocktail. Like you can say that there's influence there as well. Is it less or is it greater than the level of influence that you could potentially have over a dinner? I mean, the big issue that many people have raised as well is that the regulation around cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. I mean, there's a piece of law passing through the Hill at the moment. It's been approved by the Senate. It has to get through the House around regulation of cryptocurrencies. And so is somebody like the president, and not just the president, his family, many others who are close to him in the Oval Office are so invested in that industry themselves. Does that colour their view on regulations, particularly around, I mean, US exchequer funding itself and what happens to things being pegged to the dollar or not? And, I mean, there's a crypto czar now, isn't there, in the White House, David Sachs? We haven't had one of those before.
No, and he's been very, very active at the White House also. But I think the issue that Democrats and detractors of President Trump, the ones who allege corruption here, is that it's very hard to define and to point to something concrete to say that this is corruption. Like you said, I mean, influence is such a nebulous term. I mean, does the American voter really understand, what that means? I'm not sure they do. I'm not sure most people in government really understand what constitutes influence going forward. So I think, you know, for Democrats, that's a messaging issue because it's hard to make that case in clear terms to the American people.
Yeah, and to Katrina's point, influence is one of the oldest currencies in Washington, isn't
Exactly.
it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's power heady and power hungry in this city, isn't it?
Exactly.
It has been since the beginning of time. But we are about to hit past tense situation here ourselves on the podcast. We're out of time for today. As always, loads more to say. So we will have to catch up with that next week.
Great to see you guys. See you soon.
See you guys.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, please do like or subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we would love to hear from you. So please do leave a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.